Hi everyone, Pop the Knee Rocktano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a classic review of this Beatles album, Abbey Road. The Beatles, the Fab Four, those crazy Liverpool boys. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr. A Beatles classic review. Yeah. Which, honestly, I have been putting off for years, cause classic reviews for me have always been a kind of daunting process, even if it doesn't seem like it to you guys from your perspective watching me. Going into it, I always feel the pressure to say something new or interesting, maybe even if I can muster it profound about these albums. Albums that have amassed so much cultural currency it feels almost pointless to talk about them, because their presence and their influence is so omnipresent that it's difficult to put their cultural footprint into words. It's not like we're staring at an animal track in the dirt from shoulder height. No, it's more like we're standing in a giant crater that is just so massive that collectively we're oblivious as to how far its walls stretch out. Talking about albums that have had that kind of impact is like describing the taste of air or a scent that you've gone nose blind 2 years ago. And look, there are a lot of artists and albums that fit this description in some way, but it's especially true when it comes to Abbey Road. Oceans of ink have been spilled about this record and the history it made. It further solidified George Martin as a production titan, as it is one of the best recorded and mixed albums of all time. You also have Billy Preston on this thing, the legendary fifth Beatle, who adds some very amazing and essential organ parts. You have the renaming of the studio they recorded the bulk of this album in around the mid-70s to reflect, obviously, the Beatles and the record's iconic popularity. You also have the game-changing band photo on the cover, too, which has been copied and remixed the world over. There's a lot of mysterious lore around this record in some respects, too, like, you know, Paul's death, which was very much rumored at the time of its release, and you know, him being barefoot in the cover. You also have the publisher of Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me suing John Lennon over kind of borrowing from Chuck's lyrics and flow on the opening track, Come Together. And that's just the tip of the contextual iceberg around this project, because from there you also have its musical, its sonic, its artistic impact, both long and short term, as some of the heaviest moments on this record have been credited with helping lay the groundwork for metal. Sidebar, I wouldn't say this record is alone in that, as you do have, you know, years of hard rock coming out prior to this record, also Jimi Hendrix and heavy psych. However, there was something uniquely heavy about the song She's So Heavy, which we will get into later. You've also got the legendary medley of tracks on side B of the album, which of course was very art pop and very progressive in spirit with its jarring multiple phases and sequences. Point is, culturally, this record is treated like a very, very, very big deal, and I would argue that the music on it actually lives up to the hype. Starting with the opening track, Come Together, a song that for many is maybe at this point overplayed, and as a result of that, I think some of its magic goes a little underappreciated, because it's one of the weirdest and most cold-blooded blues rock songs of all time, and the various sonic parts that make it up, especially in its intro moments, are just iconic. From that sliding bass line, the persistent percussion on Ringo's part, that little shoop, coming through on the vocals too. The faint touches of guitar throughout the track, especially on that bridge where they get a little weepy. And the groove on the song just has an incredible swagger to it. Lennon spends the bulk of the track here singing about some character, and his descriptions of this person range from mundane to surreal and maybe even slightly scary. He says this person has feet below his knee. So what? But also, you can be held in his armchair and you'll feel his disease. In a way, he defies description, as he's got to be good looking because he's so hard to see. Overall, at least how I read it, he's trying to describe a kind of charismatic, off-putting, and maybe even cult-like figure. And soundtracking that description with rock music that just frankly sounds otherworldly to the point where it's difficult to imagine a live performance of it, which is how I've always felt about a lot of late era Beatles stuff. And of course, if you want, you can go online and find any number of bands, both amateur and professional, working out their own renditions of tracks just like this. Sometimes even to the point where they're just like nailing every single detail. But I don't know, for me personally, when it comes to the Beatles late era stuff, especially with them being such a studio animal at this point and their years of live performance kind of being behind them, it's just always been hard imagining songs like these, especially this one, existing in real life, especially on a stage. The only place I can envision them is in this weird, abstract, imaginary space, or somewhere that's not quite in my dimension, but maybe connected to it in some way, just like a slight detour off of it, which I think is also the case for the following track on here, though it scratches a very different emotional itch. That would be the George Harrison song, Something, which has been said by Frank Sinatra to be the greatest love song of the past 50 or 100 years, which is a tall order, but certainly a compliment from a guy who made his career singing and picking songs to sing. And this track to me is just love and infatuation of the highest order. As Harrison says, there's something in the way she moves that attracts him like no other lover. That's it. But even with that infatuation comes questions and unease, as on the bridge he's being asked, will his love grow? He doesn't know. He don't know. In fact, he kind of gives this person the option to stick around, and it may show. Even after this massive, extravagant, romantic display, there's no guarantees. However, I think that's just a reality of life. And kind of a nice, refreshing alternative from the many other love songs of the 60s that seem to operate in this space of love sickness where, you know, you're totally blind to any other options or maybe ups and downs that typically come with a relationship. So very simple but powerful and meaningful lyrics on this track. But as far as the sound of this song goes, it's timeless. It's gorgeous. The strings aren't overdone. They're super subtle, atmospheric, heavenly as well. Meanwhile, the vocals, the watery guitar bits, and the organs, they're there and charming and subtly messed with in such a way where they feel just a tad psychedelic, which again gives the track an otherworldly energy like as Come Together had. But again, overall, beautiful, gorgeous song, and following it, we get another very strong tone shift. I think here it's important to note that at this point in the Beatles' career, they weren't the cohesive songwriting operation that they once were in the early and mid-60s, like around the release of an album like Help, for example. An album where their overall sound and vision was a lot more cohesive and singular. And from there, the band's creative process evolved, or maybe even devolved, to the point where they were dropping some frankly ridiculous and sometimes adventurous and absurd tracks where maybe a single member was kind of leading the way on an odd excursion and everybody else in the group was kind of along for the ride. Or at least that's how the Beatles' creative process often can get narrativized among fans and the press. I mean, for example, look at how fragmented stylistically and sonically a record like the White Album is, as you get everything on that record from a birthday song to, you know, number 9, number 9. That album is going in so many different directions creatively, it's just bursting at the seams. And some people say that creative disarray is really what led to the death of the band. But at the same time, for me personally, that lack of creative control is part of what makes the White Album a personal favorite for me. And in the case of Abbey Road, I think the band does a great job of making those disparate parts come together in a harmonious fashion, especially during the medley toward the end, which we will get into. We see flashes of these weird detours and indulgences on the following track on the A-side here, Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which is a Paul McCartney track that is theatrical, and you know, it's a piano tune that is the definition of jaunty. It has some nice touches of brass brass as well. It's tracks like this that make me raise an eyebrow at the fact that John Lennon was the one who was couched as the artsy little weirdo in the band. Meanwhile, here comes Paul, who's going to write a song about a guy going on a murder spree with a hammer. Literally, as his victims are a woman he took out on a date, a teacher, and the judge at his trial, whose deaths are all described against these cutesy little bang bang sound effects in the mix, and super celebratory choruses too. It is a beautiful but also ridiculous tribute to a total asshole who Paul can't even keep himself from laughing at how preposterous his own story is at one point on a lyrica, because you can hear him like giggling to himself as he's singing. Moving on from here in the track list though, we are still very much in Paul territory, because we get Oh Darlin', which is a big Paul ballad. We gotta have a big ballad. We gotta do a big soul number where he's yelling his brains out, which for me can go one of two ways. Sometimes with Paul doing this, you will get a mix of madness and genius, like in the case of Helter Skelter, and sometimes it can get a little too cartoony or feel like a bad impression of a different singer, like in the case of a track like Why Don't We Do It in the Road? And in the case of Oh Darlin', it's a little bit more of the latter. Sometimes I wish Paul just sang in more of a regular register with this one and focused more on keeping his bass lines in check, because there's clearly a note that comes in late around 129 on the song. Keeping that lined up nice would be a lot better than, overselling the damn tune. However, I do admire his passion on the song. His desperation is certainly palpable, and I do admire the band for playing the hell out of the damn thing. The drums, the pianos, and the squawking rhythm guitars are all punching the mix as loud and as hard as possible. I'm surprised it sounds as balanced as it does. Then, following this, it's Ringo time with Octopus's Garden, and frankly, you gotta give the guy some credit on this one, not just for how cute it is, but after his most well-known song being about a yellow submarine, you would imagine that he might have like some reservations about doing another track that's nautical in any way whatsoever. But no, my dude actually just really wants to hang out under the ocean. In an Octopus's Garden, in fact, totally carefree, in the shade, warm, and hiding away from storms. It's just sweet, precious escapism with sunny vocal harmonies, bright pianos, and of course bubbles with a finish that has almost like a country twang to it. After this, we have the finish of the A-side with I Want You, She's So Heavy, which is an aching, longing, fiery blues rock tune that has these hellish transitions into some super sinister guitar passages, just fiery, fiery, fiery organ hits from Billy Preston. Some of his solo runs, too, on the track are insane. And throughout the song, we kind of switch back and forth between what sounds like a very sensual, very low-key, but still moody rock tune into these heavier, darker, more sinister, doomy, and lumbering rock passages that the more we kind of switch over to that dark side, the more expansive they get, the bigger they get, the longer we're kind of hanging in that space. That is until these sections just totally take over and repeat to the point where they're just getting heavier and thicker and louder and more crushing and more oppressive and more suffocating. The guitars and bass are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and filling up all of the empty space. You have like this Moog synth just making all of this just windy, staticky noise. It's filling up the background too. More layers, more volume, more verb. It's just really kind of looming. It's becoming just so monolithic and just massive. Frankly, it's sounding more and more metal, more and more hellish, and then after a while it just kind of cuts off. It's just brutal, absolutely brutal, just cutting it off. It's just over, it's just done, which was certainly a bold choice for its time. And in an instance of amazing sequencing, we go over to the B-side on the record, where the first thing we hear is George Harrison's Here Comes the Sun. We are going from this cold, apocalyptic, heavy rock sound to something that is plucky and acoustic and pretty and bright and good feeling. It is dazzling, it is sparkling, and in so many ways quintessentially Beatles, with its vocal harmonies and its hopeful energy, which somehow manages to increase as the song progresses. And again, it feels like another song on this album that doesn't exist in the same reality as me. I mean, to compare it to a Sunrise, I think is obvious and kind of corny. What sort of makes it difficult to kind of see this song in the same world as me is that I can't imagine somebody writing it that lives on this planet too, that is so dying and cold and nasty and disgusting. Even during the cultural era that it came out of, I could only imagine a track this positive and this, frankly, nice, coming from a world that doesn't know the pains of this one, and yet George Harrison still wrote this track, and it still kind of rose up out of the concrete like a flower, like a rose, for another corny cliche-ass analogy. Now from here we get the song Because, which kind of kicks off the medley on the record, because if you're not familiar, in the second half of this LP, we don't have a whole lot of very full-length, complete songs with very defined structures, beginnings and ends. Rather, we are getting these short motif or, you know, vignette-type pieces that segue into one another or introduce each other, reference back sometimes too. And not too long prior to this, the band had flirted with songs that have more experimental or linear structures. But this is the first time that they really, like, extended it out for the length of an entire, you know, side of a record, which was certainly an ambitious feat, and one that to this day is held in very high regard, which is what makes this LP so special. But yeah, to go back to Because, another quintessentially Beatles moment with these wintry and gorgeous and surreal and stacked vocal harmonies. Without over-explaining this track, it is mystifying and ends on a bit of a cliffhanger because it does in a way feel like a tone setter for the following track, You Never Give Me Your Money, which starts like your typical sad little Paul McCartney piano ballad with lyrics that treat love like it's a financial mediation of some sort. And while it is on the long side in comparison with some of the other tracks on the second half of this record, it still feels just as fragmented, as from here you kind of jump into a bit of cartoony piano rock, more psych pop with super grand vocal harmonies, as well as another instrumental shift where you get these heartening little vocal passages with the group singing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all God's children go to heaven. It's kind of like you're getting several songs in one here. And past this point, things kind of speed up in terms of the tone shifts in between tracks and how quickly we're moving from one moment to the next. You have Sun King, which feels very much like a warm island guitar oasis, which George Harrison would say in an interview was at least in part inspired by an instrumental track that Fleetwood Mac had dropped around that time, Albatross. But yeah, overall this is very much a piece of sunshine psych with pretty building vocals and keys, and toward the end, this kind of weird, jargony, fake Spanish section that, again, feels like the band doing anything to avoid sounding regular and normal and just in touch with reality. After this, it is an overt switch-up. It is a hard and jarring change with Mean Mr. Mustard, a silly piano tune that is a character portrait about a guy that's a real bastard, mentions his sister Pam, who is clearly being referenced in the following track, as well as her taking him to see the Queen, which is why it's sort of understandable narratively why in the original sort of like composition of this medley piece, Her Majesty, the final song on this record, was actually in this section. You can actually hear the first chord that plays on Her Majesty is actually the last chord on Mean Mr. Mustard, but apparently that got snipped out and moved toward the very end, and instead, at the very end of Mr. Mustard, we get the first chord on Polythene Pam, which in its own right, like Mean Mr. Mustard, is another odd character portrait or description of sorts, talking about this person saying she's a woman, but she looks like a man, and have you seen her in drag? It's a very gender-bent moment where the most complimentary thing said about this person is that she's attractively built. Meanwhile, she came in through the bathroom window as a much more dancey and luxurious tone shift. Narratively, it's not explicitly said whether or not we're singing about a different person than Pam here per se. So in a way, I guess you could read it as such, even though it is said that it's a very real and different experience from Paul that actually inspired this one. But yeah, this one's a very groovy number, after which we actually get a pretty big amount of space, kind of a breather, where the medley takes a very theatrical turn. Really feels like it breaks off a bit, but there are still some key callbacks to earlier on the record. With Golden Slumbers, we get this very big dramatic showing of strings and horns and pianos for a lullaby that is described in the lyrics but never really quite happens. I mean, it is gorgeous and it is powerful, but I would be pretty angry if Paul McCartney went through all of this trouble to set up a lullaby only for him to kind of lead into, "Boy, you're gonna carry that weight, carry that weight." Thanks, man. Gonna doze right off to this one. But yeah, with the following "Carry That Weight," you get this immense and amazing big chorus group vocal passage, as well as a melodic reprise that goes back to "You Never Give Me Your Money." Toward the very end, some guitar bits that reference back to Sun King. And with the end, we just have a powerful, rockin', fun finisher with dueling guitar solo bits. There's confetti flying, people are dancing in the street, and then we kind of get this heavenly ascent of vocals and keys that bring things to a very bright and warm place. Then once this closes up again, we hear that kind of big chord crash at the start of Her Majesty, and then there's a little acoustic ditty with some fingerpick guitar, some strumming, and lyrics that are, yes, about Her Majesty, and sing about her in a very loving but also kind of irreverent way. Like, I want to tell her that I love her a lot, but I gotta get a belly full of wine. Her Majesty's a pretty nice gal, someday I'm gonna make her mine. Very cheeky and silly way to end off your over-the-top and amazingly produced art pop opus. And in a nutshell, yeah, that's pretty much what Abbey Road is. And frankly, that's why I love it. And there you go. That's my review, my classic review of this album. Transition, have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, The Beatles, Abbey Road, forever.